We are back, and we are joined again by Greg Stoker, former United States Army Ranger and geopolitical analyst, host of the anti-imperialist Colonial Outcasts podcast. Greg, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, your background, I think people may be familiar, but for those who aren't, you enlisted right after high school. You served in the U.S. Army, as I mentioned. So, if you were to guess, or based on conversations you've had with people, what is the appetite within the U.S. Armed Services to go to war to back up Israel as they're committing genocide?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of people within the United States military don't see it as a genocide. The word terrorist has been weaponized for generations to basically be used as a mechanism of the great powers to condemn forms of violence that they don't approve of. So a lot of people are still drinking the Kool-Aid. However, the big question is the massive U.S. military-wide recruiting crisis that is ongoing. That's a real threat to United States capabilities going forward, especially fighting a near peer like China in the future. You know, we have a whole situation going on with Taiwan. And there's also a massive retention crisis because there are people having moral qualms about what's happening in the Middle East, concerns about getting into another nebulous forever war in that region. So there's a retention crisis as well. And that's where experienced veterans with dozens of like 5, 10, maybe 15 years of experience will not re-enlist to do another 5 years. They'll just get out. So there's a lot of national security ramifications and consequences for U.S. foreign policy right now, backing Israel unconditionally.
Right. I mean, we know that there are some troops in the region, as we have mentioned. Biden has now come out publicly and basically told Israel not to attack Iran's nuclear sites, which, like, the idea that he even had to say that publicly is immensely concerning to me. I mean, I guess let's go and do a little bit of a recap of what we've seen over the past week and a half with Israel bombing the hell out of Lebanon, killing hundreds of people after they did 2 mass terrorist attacks, I would argue, with the pager explosion and the walkie-talkie explosion, sowing terror throughout Lebanon. It's basically a way to make people feel a lot of fear. Then they carpet bomb large areas outside of Beirut, and they killed hundreds of people. Last night, they also bombed a residential building apartment building in Beirut that had associations with Hezbollah, but it was right next to a hospital, and there's a lot of just other massive ramifications from that. Over 1 million people in Lebanon have already been displaced. That's, I guess, the broad understanding of what Israel's done in Lebanon. But, like, in terms of on the ground in southern Lebanon and what Hezbollah is dealing with, can you just break down these events since then?
Well, I mean, I could definitely talk about the tactical situation going forward, and I think that's the best way to describe the insanity of this operation. So actually, just before now, for my show on Mint Press News later tonight, I interviewed a former Marine Corps drill instructor who worked with the IDF, and we were just talking about their complete lack of discipline, lack of situational awareness, lack of competence. They basically only take pride in their ability to get F-35s, JDAMs, and press a button. And if you look at white papers from U.S. Army war colleges from 2006, they're doing exactly what they did in 2006 now that led to their defeat. An over-reliance on bombing campaigns, a lack of ground maneuverability, an unwillingness to like get out of their vehicles and actually clear through terrain features. They just, like, as we saw in Gaza, they like to stay buttoned up in their APCs and their tanks, not actually get out, which makes the tanks very vulnerable, but that's a different aspect. And then a massive information operations, or what we would in the civilian terms call a propaganda campaign, to portray a image of defeat for Hezbollah and an image of total victory for Israel. And so one of the main problems with their whole, like, the pager attack was this massive intelligence coup. It was more of like a James Bond villain operation that James Bond in the movie would be trying to stop, because
Right.
if anybody but Israel did that, it would be considered a terrorist attack, especially if Hezbollah did the same thing, but
Exactly.
with IDF soldiers. So that's one form of hypocrisy. But they said their entire command structure has been taken out. Well, first of all, Hezbollah was born out of a guerrilla insurgent force movement to occupation. They are designed to function in cells, in networks that are independent of an overarching command structure. So they have different SOPs, standard operating procedures for what happens in certain areas when an invasion starts. Now, the terrain in southern Lebanon is mountainous. It's full of cover and concealment through like rocks, trees, and Hezbollah, even though they're degraded to some extent, I mean, they're still effective. They're not the only guerrilla force, armed group in southern Lebanon. It's like when people use the blanket term of Hamas in Gaza. There's also PIJ, the PFLP. It's not just Hezbollah that's going to be fighting against this incursion. So basically what they have to do is they have to invade, conduct complex ground maneuvers that integrate combined arms. So tanks working with infantry, working with artillery, working with air assets. We've never seen them do this because they can't achieve it. So on the first stage of the invasion, they set in commando teams or special operations teams to do reconnaissance raids against weapons caches, safe houses to collect intelligence. And then they sent in kind of like a spearhead of infantry and some armor. A couple of their incursions were pushed back. There's a lot of fog of war going on. But what you have to understand about the Hezbollah position, they've honeycombed their entire military infrastructure in tunnels throughout all of Lebanon. And so there's no breaking through the front lines of Hezbollah because they have defense in depth, which means like if they get pushed back from a position, they fall back to another position behind that. And there's like sniper's nest, there's HBIDs, which is house-borne IEDs. So that's basically a house that's booby-trapped to explode. So last night, an entire Israeli commando team went inside one of them, and they lost the entire squad. So yeah, they're taking sustained casualties. It's a lot gnarlier than what we're seeing right now, but they, of course, have a media blackout on all operations. We don't see how they could possibly come out of this on top. Their stated military objective is to roll Hezbollah up to the Litani River and create a buffer zone.
Yeah.
In order
but reoccupy southern Lebanon, which Hezbollah already kicked them out of previously, and it was a hornet's nest at the time.
Yeah, and in order to reoccupy and create a buffer zone, they would have to clear all of southern Lebanon, which they can't do because they couldn't clear Gaza. They couldn't defeat Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is still active there. They continue to attrit or cause combat attrition to Israeli armor and infantry units there. They haven't gone away, and they're doing a third operation in West Bank, a multi-brigade action in West Bank called Operation Summer Camps, which is basically just a big bulldozer fiesta. And now they want to escalate against Iran. It's just completely insane. They're stretched thin, and they're running out of ammunition. I'm not sure what they expect to get out of this. It's giving like mission accomplished, war in Iraq vibes.
Yes, and the focus on like these aesthetic victories is really fascinating to me because it's so much about the propaganda value about decapitating Hezbollah by killing Nasrallah, or about decapitating Hamas by assassinating their lead negotiator in Tehran itself, which was a provocation that Iran didn't even really respond to, which underscores their level of restraint so far. But let's just pull up this graph from Bloomberg because I think it's really helpful to show people. We showed this the other day about the nature of the strikes and the artillery being used by Hezbollah and by the IDF. And you can just see there, one, in terms of volume, since October 7th, Israel's attacks into Lebanon on Hezbollah have far outnumbered the ones that Hezbollah has lobbed back at Israel. But again, Hezbollah doesn't have this complex military defense system like Israel does, which is the Iron Dome. But two, to your point about the usage of like these kind of pressing, how Israeli forces want to focus on just like pressing a button and then sending a bomb over there, you can see how often Israel is using airstrikes against Hezbollah, but that dark yellow is supposed to indicate Hezbollah is doing the equivalent, and you can barely discern that there. So if you could just give us a sense of like the difference in terms of the weaponry being used, Hezbollah versus what Israel is doing.
Well, I think what's more salient to the question is what are the targets? So there is this idea that Israel just strikes random civilian targets. I think that's true to a certain extent, but they are definitely targeting military personnel. They just don't care about
How many
civilian
civilians
casualties.
died? Yeah.
Yeah, so they're like, oh, he's in an apartment complex with 60 other families. Well, he's there, so they'll just drop it. So I don't think it's necessarily carpet bombing. Based off of the battle damage and the locations, I haven't seen any evidence of carpet bombing. I think it's more like, oh, well, I guess we're going to have to drop the entire neighborhood, which is what happened with Nasrallah. So it's they just don't have any collateral damage estimate or methodology that the U.S. Army, for all its sins, does. So
Right.
it's actually quite egregious, and it goes back to their military doctrine, which is actually named after the suburb that they're actively bombing right now, the Da'iyah doctrine. It's to collectively punish the civilian population in order to get them to rise up or put political pressure on Hezbollah or Hamas in Gaza to surrender, lay down arms, or give diplomatic concessions that they don't want to give. Now, the second is targeting. Hezbollah, for the most part, has only targeted military intelligence sites, sensors, and barracks full of soldiers. There's very little evidence to see that they have intentionally targeted civilian areas, which of course that is not serving their interest. There's also a component to this war that's based off of information operations or like creating soft power. So they're labeled a terrorist organization. By the Western powers, they have a vested interest in bucking that stereotype for legitimacy and to delegitimize Israel. And that's kind of like why Hamas, one of the reasons that they've treated the hostages so well, that's why they've waged the war at post October 7th a certain way. There's no evidence of them like really stealing aid or doing any of the things that they're accused of, hiding in hospitals, because both Hezbollah and Hamas in Gaza, it's asymmetrical warfare. So they actually cannot defeat the IDF in the field because they don't have an air force, they don't have entire fleets of like Reaper and Predator drones or hundreds of thousands of reservists to call upon. But they can defeat them politically. So it's in Hezbollah's vested interest and Iran's vested interest to only target military sites. And we saw that with Iran's attack a couple days ago. They hit Nasaram Air Force Base and some empty areas, but it was generally the impacts that we can discern are on military targets. So I think that's one important aspect to recognize, that they are also waging an information war based off their targeting, whereas Israel basically has this entire media apparatus that they control. So there's also a lot of IO information warfare happening right now. And when it comes to ordnance that Hezbollah is using, they're using a lot of the strikes that are successful are actually anti-tank weapons and not rockets, because anti-tank are line of sight, so they don't have a trajectory that the radar and the Iron Dome can pick up and then send a missile to intercept.
And Hamas doesn't have anti-tank technology. I mean, this is why Hezbollah is the strongest militia that has the ability to fight Israel on the ground.
Technically, Hamas does. They have like 70s stuff, like dual phase RPGs,
Okay.
which can disable a tank, but it can't. It's generally not going to get an engine or crew kill. Like the level of training, because Hamas has to train in an open air concentration camp. They have closed supply lines. They have to smuggle everything in. Whereas Hezbollah can be a professional fighting force. That's just the nature of their two realities. So yeah, it's gonna be messy. It already is messy. The incursion into southern Lebanon has already stalled. But the question is, can Israel, and by extension the United States and the collective West, afford to back down and be seen to be defeated?
Well, that's the other question about Iran's attack, where they leveled a bunch of bombs basically at Tel Aviv, but a majority of them were intercepted, of course, by the Iron Dome. The ones that got through, it seemed very tactical, as you mentioned, were targeting, I think they were right outside the Mossad headquarters, as well as other bases that were obviously military targets. So the propaganda value for Iran here, like, they were essentially cornered into responding because they didn't respond to multiple provocations for quite a while. As I mentioned, the assassination in Tehran of the top lead Hamas negotiator, the attacks on Beirut too, and like they had to come at one point and back up Hezbollah to a certain degree, and then Israel also started bombing Yemen and the Houthis and other groups that have alliances with Iran. So like, what is the value of Iran being able to show video of their rockets penetrating the Iron Dome and getting to Israeli military sites? Is that a win for Iran in this instance? And since no Israelis died, is that an off-ramp for Israel, or am I doing some wishful thinking here?
No, I think, well, first of all, I think we need to appreciate the place, the internal space that the Iron Dome occupies in the public consciousness of Israel. It's their magical umbrella that keeps them safe and allows them to act with impunity in the region. And because they'll always be protected from rockets from what Iran calls the axis of resistance, and from Iran itself. It was penetrated. We saw at least 30 strikes from multiple angles, so we know it's not like we can actually count them throughout. It was a massive success in defeating the Iron Dome. And Iran has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, probably millions of rockets, right? That was just 200. And the question now is, can they sustain that level of fire while being under attack from Israel? Because Israel might have nukes, but Iran could achieve complete target devastation. And the reason Israel hates Iran so much, one of the reasons, is because it's the only power in the region that can check their impunity. Now, it is an off-ramp because they didn't kill anyone. They didn't destroy any civilian targets.
They did kill a Palestinian, but Israel, of course, doesn't care about that.
Well, I mean, they've certainly capitalized on it for a propaganda piece.
Right.
So it does give them an off-ramp. It gives them the opportunity to recognize that the Iron Dome experienced a systemic failure, either because there were too many targets it couldn't attack, or because it ran out of ammunition too fast. We'll never know. So it allows them to be like, oh, Iran's this backwards country with this paper tiger of a military. They can't even penetrate the Iron Dome or kill anybody. And what Israel should do, I think, is just blast the propaganda to their own public, blast it into the West, be like, yes, Iran is completely incompetent. They're not really a threat. We don't really need to respond because we're fighting against Hezbollah and we're going to destroy their proxy. Leave it at that. That would be the sensible thing to do. That wouldn't ignite a regional war. However, but we've seen this entire media push that they're doing. They're putting on like IDF officers and Benjamin Netanyahu are just on like saying the most hawkish things. And you have, what is it, Brett Stevens in the New York Times writing an op-ed that bombing like a war with Iran is a must. I forget the headline, but it was insane. It reminded me of like 2003 push to Iraq war type stuff that we saw in the media. And I don't know, they should definitely de-escalate. Iran did give them an off-ramp, but I'm not sure if they can tolerate off-ramps.
And is it your assessment that the United States is at least having back-channel conversations with the Iranians? Because I think Israel's trying to portray the fact that they knew when the attack was coming an hour before Iran launched the missiles at Tel Aviv and other parts of Israel. They're trying to portray that as if this is some espionage win, when I wouldn't be shocked if the United States is communicating with the Iranians via intermediaries to get some of this information.
Yeah, even in a war, like our security people will talk to their security people because we don't want mass annihilation. So whether they did or not, I'm not sure. There was definitely back-channel communications before the first strike where the U.S., because the U.S. was saying like, hey, we're not going to get involved. We're going to do intercepts, but we will not support any reprisal. Because both the U.S. and Iran do not want to go to war with each other.
Yep.
Iran has been struggling under economic sanctions for a long time. Their economy is finally in an upturn. They also want other things from the U.S. They want a better nuclear deal. They want a sanction relief. And what we saw the other night with the Iranian missile attack, if they can get through the Iron Dome, that means they can concentrate fire and wipe any U.S. base that's in the Middle East completely off the map. Because our air defense systems that guard our bases are like tiny compared to the Iron Dome. They have like Patriot batteries that can only do a certain number of intercepts, and they take like 20 minutes to reload. So they're incredibly vulnerable. So are our oil assets in the region. Iran could shut down the Strait of Hormuz, and if you don't like gas prices now, well, they're going to surge right before an election.
Yep.
So that's going to be a problem too. Like, this entire situation is a mess, and Biden is the one who could pretty much stop it all. He won't.
Yep.
He will say, like, I support a ceasefire with Hezbollah, and these are my red lines, but Rafah was a red line. The limited operation in Rafah, which destroyed 40% of it, was supposed to be a red line. So whatever he says, he's going to back Israel unconditionally with weapons and munitions, and so is his successor, Harris, and most likely Trump. So, yeah.
The red line might, though, be involving the United States in the regional war just for his own political. I mean, I guess he's a lame duck. Who cares? But I mean, it seems like that's been the only thing that they've insisted upon, because they don't care about the genocide in Gaza. It's basically like Israel can conduct its affairs in the open air concentration camp that it controls no matter what. But if it imperils, like, say, I don't know, U.S. interests in the region, where you see reports that Lloyd Austin was made aware of the Nasrallah strike like right before they did it, according to the Jerusalem Post, and that he was furious about it, and how his counterpart Yoav Gallant basically was like, hey, sorry, and didn't communicate with him in that same way. Like, there's a world, I feel like, where the strategic value of Israel, yeah, like, they can commit genocide, whatever, but if you're going to drag the United States into this and imperil, I don't know, Pentagon interests, perhaps that's the actual red line. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting to look at troop deployments throughout the Middle East. We're not really in a combat ground war posture right now. So I tend to try to break through like sensationalist wartime reporting, saying that, like, yes, we're sending thousands more troops to the Middle East. Okay, what are the troops, though? Are they active duty combat units like a Marine Expeditionary Force or like the 101st Airborne Division? No, they're mostly support personnel for an extra couple fighter wings that are going to Qatar and other air bases in the Gulf. And it's not, and the only reason there's an influx of troops is because some air wings were supposed to come back and rotate out with the new one incoming, but they're just going to stay there until this cools off. So I monitor troop deployments because that's a big red flag if I start seeing an actual increase, but with particular types of units. So if World War III does happen, it's not going to happen yet, and there's still a couple rungs left to go up the escalation ladder until that does happen.
I guess then your thoughts on, we don't need to play the full clip, perhaps we'll do it later, but Christian Amanpour spoke with the Lebanese foreign minister, and he essentially said that basically she asked him what he thought about American leaders supporting Israel's incursion into Lebanon, and then the Lebanese foreign minister essentially indicated that he thinks Nasrallah was going to agree to a ceasefire before Israel killed him. Now, I have a few questions about this. One, the Lebanese government is basically, non-functioning at this point. What is their relationship? What is this Lebanese foreign minister's relationship with Israel? What is his relationship with the United States? I don't have the sense of the politics of the country to be able to assess that more accurately. Is it implying that Nasrallah was going to agree to a ceasefire before there was one in Gaza? Or I'm not exactly sure. I guess, what's your take on that news that Amanpour broke when speaking to the Lebanese foreign minister? Well,
first of all, it could be completely untrue or a fabrication, because the foreign minister has a vested interest in, discrediting any Israeli offensive into his country. And so, right, saying that they were going to agree to a ceasefire and that's why they killed him, well, that makes the Israeli casus belli for like cause for war even more tenuous. However, Israel has established a precedent of killing more reasonable pro-ceasefire voices within these organizations or these movements like Hamas and Hezbollah. The prime and most recent example is Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. He was certainly less militant than Yahya Sinwar, and he was part of the head of the political bureau of Hamas, and he was actively pushing for a ceasefire, maybe even to the point of compromising in some ways that they didn't initially want to compromise under. So it's both situations for me. Looking at it are likely.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I guess really lastly, what are your predictions in terms of where things go from here? If Israel pursues basically a ground invasion of Lebanon, it doesn't seem to me like they're going to be able to support this effort for quite a while. I mean, there's reports of IDF soldier fatigue just in terms of what they're dealing with domestically. I know Netanyahu solidified his position, and there have been a lot of people who have fled Israel, right, dual citizens. But in terms of over a year of fighting for the IDF, what does that mean domestically for Israel?
Well, first of all, it means a number of things. They've activated tens, not hundreds of thousands of reservists, taking them indefinitely out of the workforce. That has massive economic repercussions. Then you have people fleeing the country, out of the workforce, out of the economy indefinitely, forever. Then you have a loss of investment. Intel was supposed to build that multi-billion-dollar chip factory in Israel, but they won't, because they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders not to have it get blown up by Hezbollah, because Israel is no longer secure. Right. There's a lot of factors. There's not just army fatigue. We also have to fund them. But when it comes to the Lebanon invasion, like they're not professional soldiers. The bulk of the Israeli army are conscripts, and very undisciplined conscripts. They've only had like 2 years of military service, at which point in the U.S. Army, you're still pretty much a freaking dumbass private at that point. And their leaders are way too young. They have like 19-year-old sergeants. I didn't attain like a non-commissioned officer rank until I was 23, and that was considered fast-tracking it. They're like not emotionally or intellectually up or psychologically up to par. And most of them are reserves. They did their 2 years of service. They've been out for years, potentially, and they thought they were going to spend the rest of their lives having a good life, working IT in Tel Aviv, and now they're like going into essentially the lion's den. And we saw videos of them praying before, and I've been into it. In Afghanistan, I can notice when people are scared, they're terrified. So there's a huge morale issue. There's a propaganda screen. We're both on the far right platform that is X, formerly Twitter. So we see the narrative that's going around by paid propagandists, and it's not the reality on the ground. They're not prepared to fight a ground war, just like in 2006, because looking at what they're doing now in Gaza and in Lebanon and comparing it to how that operation in 2006 went down, they haven't updated anything. And I think it's going to go much the same way. The Israeli army is used to conducting short 4 to 6 week violent wars where they saturation bomb everything. Now, they're fighting a war of attrition the first time, and they don't have the architecture or infrastructure to do so. So they're going to keep fighting in Lebanon as long as they can. I don't know how long it's going to be. They're going to declare victory without achieving any of their objectives. And it's convenient that they haven't really given any operational objectives for the ground invasion. So that's kind of like, is it really a military operation, or are they trying to just take more land? Either way, it's not strategically or tactically viable at all, and it's not going to end well for anybody. Beirut's going to get bombed relentlessly, and the Bekaa Valley, especially the more losses that they take on the ground, and it's just going to be what we, and sorry to curse on your channel,
go for it.
It's what we would call in the military an absolute unmitigated shit show. That's how the operation's going to end.
Yeah, and I mean, how can they defeat Hezbollah? They have not defeated Hamas at all. They haven't made any ground in that regard. And it doesn't even matter, just as a meta point, like, if you defeat Hezbollah, you defeat Hamas. Okay, resistance is going to call itself something new when it crops up the next time. So that's the problem. And then they're also bombing multiple other countries. There's some unverified reports about bombings this morning. I haven't been able to read into that, but...
No, there's some unverified reports that some airstrikes landed close to a Russian base and may perhaps blow up a Russian ammo depot. So, yeah.
In which country was that? Was that Syria?
Syria.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a whole nother rabbit hole, though.
Another way to get the United States involved, then, right?
Yeah.
It seems like that might be the aim. But anyway, Greg Stoker, it's always great to talk to you. You should check out the Colonial Outcasts podcast. You guys also have a Patreon. We'll put a link to that wherever people are listening to or watching this. Thanks so much, Greg.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.